I'm here today with Professor Thomas Sugrue, Professor of History and Social and Cultural Analysis at New York University. He is the author of The Origins of the Urban Crisis, Race and Inequality in Post-War Detroit, the author of The Sweet Land of Liberty, which is about the persistence of segregation in the northern United States. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Your first book, The Post-War Origins of the Urban Crisis in Detroit. What were what you might call seeds of destruction? What led to the outcome, the violent decline from the arsenal of democracy to the, what you might call the second Pearl Harbor?
Well, the conventional wisdom about Detroit is that the city's problems began in the 1960s with growing racial conflict, with the rise of a Black Power movement, with the urban riot or uprising of 1967, and then with the global restructuring of the auto industry in the 1970s and beyond. And as a historian, I started digging around, really trying to make sense out of what happened in terms of race, what happened in terms of economics in metropolitan Detroit. And it became very clear to me that to understand what happened to the city requires going significantly further back than the tumult of the 1960s or the economic woes of the 1970s. Really beginning in World War II and the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, Detroit was reshaped by three major forces that were occurring simultaneously and interacting with each other. The first was the persistent discrimination by race, particularly in the city's labor markets. As African Americans moved in extraordinary numbers to the city, beginning in the teens and 20s, but especially
from the southern United States.
From the South, yeah. And they moved there in search of economic opportunity. There were refugees from the violent system of Jim Crow. But they found a labor market that was really hardened against African Americans, where huge sectors of the city's blue collar, not to mention its white collar work, were entirely closed to African Americans. That discrimination came under siege by civil rights activists beginning in the 40s and 50s, but it took a lot of effort for sometimes relatively modest gains. So discrimination in the workplace is really important. The second, Detroit, like most major American industrial cities, began to hemorrhage jobs well before the globalization of the 1970s, well before the rise of competition in the auto industry with the Germans and Japanese after 1973, well before the oil shocks of 1973-74, which are often blamed for the collapse of the auto industry. Detroit lost about 134,000 manufacturing jobs between 1948 and 1963. A huge number of jobs, in other words, in a relatively short period of time. So this is the second of the major factors. Detroit undergoes a period of industrial disinvestment that ripples through the entire regional economy. As the auto industry begins to decentralize, to relocate to other parts of the United States, auto parts companies and others are moving in search of cheap labor. And as a consequence, that affects the city's property tax base because factories are closing and companies aren't paying the same into the city's revenue, into the city's coffers. It affects commerce and the city's consumer marketplace because folks don't have as much money in their pockets. The number of building permits in Detroit plummets in the years after the auto industry begins to move out because of essentially the flight of capital. So that's the second. The third is, and maybe the most definitive, is persistent residential segregation by race in the city's housing market. That's the consequence of the actions of ordinary whites who engaged in violence against the first African Americans to move into their neighborhoods. It was the consequence of real estate brokers who explicitly discriminated against African Americans in terms of where they would show them houses or allow them to rent. And third, it was a result of federal pro-home ownership policies beginning in the New Deal that made it possible for tens of thousands of Detroiters, hundreds of thousands of Detroiters to own their own homes. Through the FHA, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, the Veterans Administration, essentially providing guaranteed 30-year mortgages for folks to own their own homes. Those were restricted pretty much to whites only and to new housing developments that were racially segregated or primarily white. As a consequence, African Americans didn't have free choice in the metropolitan Detroit housing market. So you put all those together, workplace discrimination, the flight of jobs, and housing segregation, all occurring in the supposed heyday of the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, and you see the groundwork laid for the racial conflict and for the intensifying racial inequalities of the 1960s and beyond.
The black people, many of whom fought in World War II, are discriminated against in Detroit. As jobs disappear, whether you're black or white, fear for your economic security exacerbates fear and that kind of tendency towards otherness, saying those guys are threatening my existence. And finding people that didn't look like you created that. And I guess I say it wasn't just a product of the imagination, it was a product of the history of discrimination.
Definitely.
And then third, the inability of white people and black people to intermingle, to be integrated in neighborhoods, never, how do you say, eroded those fears or those boundaries and exacerbated the hostilities. People who had wealth in a home feared that if black people came in, it would destroy their wealth. People who didn't have access to that wealth generation feared the loss of opportunity for them and their children. And so you can see the polarization from those three pillars building up for a great many years. And then in the aftermath of 1967, I would say the pressures started to overwhelm the metropolitan area in a way that was had been smoldering or building, but now were evident to everyone.
That's right. So what you see in the streets of the city and the workplaces of the city is struggle, contest over access to jobs, especially access to well-paying, secure jobs with good benefits. Struggles over access to decent housing in neighborhoods with good amenities, good city services, and good schools. African Americans are pushing to get access to those better paying jobs, those better houses and better neighborhoods. And whites are pushing back, often really ferociously. I mean, I found in my research more than 200 attacks on the first or second African American families to move into formerly white neighborhoods. Usually window breaking, sometimes arson, all sorts of petty vandalism, as a way of essentially saying, stay out. We don't want you jeopardizing our financial well-being, our turf, our sense of identity, and our economic self-interest.
And that access to school systems was the product of what you might call municipally organized education structure, as distinct from what you might call a federal platform where in all different regions you could have excellent schools.
Absolutely. I mean, in metropolitan Detroit, by the early 1970s, there were 53 separate school districts. And those school districts reflected the balkanization of the city's housing markets, or the metropolitan area's housing markets, of local tax bases, since public schools are almost all funded by local property taxes.
Right.
It essentially means that an arbitrary municipal boundary separating Detroit from one of the northern suburbs could be as real as a 10-foot high, foot-thick cement wall dividing those two in terms of the allocation of resources. One would have a good property tax base to draw from to provide well-funded schools, sometimes schools that were almost de facto private schools. They were so well provided for. The other dealing with declining tax base, an increasingly impoverished population with greater needs. Essentially, we created a public school system in metropolitan Detroit and in a lot of metropolitan America that took resources away from those who needed them the most and gave more resources to those who already had, further perpetuating racial inequality and regional inequality.
And then we saw more and more movement, particularly of white Americans, to the suburbs, a continued downward spiral in the tax and resource base within the city. Ordinance, school systems, firefighting, all these things suffered. And you didn't really have even the ability to enforce the collection of city taxes for suburban workers who worked in the city.
That's right.
And it resulted, of course, in the Detroit bankruptcy.
The conventional wisdom on Detroit was very much that it was the problem of bad leadership in the city. It was a problem of corruption. It was a problem of extravagant spending in a place that didn't have the resources to spend. Au contraire, I mean, Detroit went through a period of pretty significant fiscal austerity in the 1970s and 1980s. It had to. This was a city that was on a trajectory from having 1.85 million people in 1950 to having about 700,000 people in 2010. A dramatic population collapse. And with that came a dramatic decline in the revenue available for the city. Detroit also did have, the cost of maintaining a creaking, increasingly decrepit infrastructure. The city is mostly an early 20th century city. Sewers, the roads, the street lights. You've got the need for police and fire services over 139 square miles. These are costly. And you have, the wave of retired city employees who had negotiated pensions, in part as sort of compensation for taking lower paid jobs in the public sector than they could have gotten in the private sector. But those summed up to be pretty substantial costs by the early 2000s. And so the bankruptcy needs to be seen not simply as a product of the very recent past, but in some ways as one of the perverse consequences of a long-term process that I describe in the book that goes before the 1970s.
Let's move now to talk about your next book, about segregation in the North. All of us who grew up around the civil rights movement and everything else saw problems of racial polarity and hostility and atrocities going back through slavery in the South. Your newer book, raises the specter of what you might call an unvisited crime that's ongoing. What inspired you to write the second book?
In some ways, it's a national level sequel to Origins of the Urban Crisis. I was interested both in understanding the ways in which racial inequality and injustice was something that was not just a story of segregated drinking fountains and lunch counters or lynch mobs in the South, but had deeper roots and a national scope. And I was also interested in the ways in which politicians, policymakers, grassroots activists attempted to address these pressing questions of racial injustice in the United States. And so it's a story both of the obstacles that we face to racial equality in the United States. It's a story of the obstacles we face, but also a story of the ways in which activists and policymakers creatively tried to overcome those obstacles, sometimes with noteworthy successes, sometimes with abysmal failure. So it's really trying to get at both of those dimensions. But so much of our history of civil rights in the United States, what we learn in the classroom, what we see in movie theaters and in documentaries, is the problem of race in the United States is a Southern problem. It's part of the legacy of the peculiar institution, right? Yeah. And that's not to deny that there's a distinctive system of racial injustice in the United States that does derive from the system of slavery in the South, right? There was a system of Jim Crow, of officially regimented racial segregation or apartheid by race in the South that begins in the late 19th century. But to see that as the sole locus of racial injustice in the United States overlooks the fact that Detroit and so many other cities like Detroit in the North were intensely segregated by race, segregated to the point of being almost complete, of blacks and whites not sharing the same neighborhoods, not living side by side, not going to school with each other, not mixing in any social settings, not going to church together, not playing on the same baseball teams. I mean, essentially living entirely separate lives in a way that would have pleased all but the most hardcore Southern architects of segregation and Jim Crow. When we look at the North, we see everyday segregation playing out in public accommodations, hotels, swimming pools, restaurants, in ways that we associate with Montgomery and Birmingham and Nashville and Greensboro and Selma, the places that were the major sites of the civil rights struggle, but which are playing out with the same intensity in places like Chicago, New York, Detroit. But because the television camera is focused on the South, because some of the most dramatic conflicts in the civil rights era happened in places like Birmingham and Montgomery, we've averted our attention away from what happens in, at least for those of us living in the Northeast or Midwest, our backyards. And in some ways, it lets much of America off the hook to blame some stone-cold racists south of the Mason-Dixon line for America's woes, when really those problems are national in scope. And many of the most astute activists at the time, including those associated with the Southern movement, Martin Luther King Jr., recognized that the problem of racial inequality was a national problem.
You talked about structure, like in Detroit, we talked about job discrimination, housing segregation, and deindustrialization. As you look more broadly in this second book, what are the, which you might call the structural pillars that are the obstacles that have to be overcome in order to, how to say, ameliorate this racial polarity that seems to be even rising in the last few years?
Well, in my book, Sweet Land of Liberty, I ended up writing much more than I did in my book on Detroit about public education and about the really profound racial disparities in public education. Again, that's a story that we often think about, south of the Mason-Dixon line, where the Supreme Court had to order desegregation as a way of breaking down schools that were marked the colored school or the Negro school versus the white school. But segregation was just as intense in northern metropolitan areas, but it was part of the everyday, the taken for granted fabric. It was often described as de facto segregation, as if it was just a fact of life, as if it was just a natural consequence of individual choices about where to live and where to send your children to school. Whereas housing segregation and educational segregation in the North were peas in a pod. One depended on the other. Where you lived determined where your kids went to school. It determined how well funded your school would be. It determined the racial composition of your kids' classmates. And that was built into the very fabric of metropolitan America, in the North especially, in ways that folks perceived at the time as somehow different from what was going on in the South. The South, they put up a sign and said, whites only in a school, or they refused to admit black students. In the North, the barriers to entry were school district boundaries. They were real estate brokers showing white parents a house in a predominantly white first-rate school district, but not showing houses to African Americans there. So I began thinking a lot about education, particularly at a moment when educational inequality really intensified. There are huge gaps in funding between school districts in metropolitan America and most states as a result of reliance on local tax revenue. And so most African Americans ended up in northern areas going to schools in communities that were overwhelmingly African American. Most whites went to schools that were overwhelmingly white. And it was incredibly difficult to pull those together. We created a really perverse form of educational policy in the United States when it comes to place and race and education, which is we put most resources into the places where students have the most resources and fewest resources into places where the students who had the greatest needs. And we rationalize that as a result of local control, ostensibly race-neutral ideas about the allocation of resources in public education.
And we've seen, economists often talk about opportunity prospectively, and which you might call removing the impediments to opportunity. And while I think that's healthy, we do have to depend a little bit on outcomes as a measure of our success. And assuming that the world is a whiteboard of opportunity, when in essence upper middle class white people look like they're surfing and most black youth look like they're swimming up waterfalls across a whole spectrum of categories, which you might call denies the notion that we have a whiteboard of equality out in front of all of us. And what's even worse, as I mentioned, the outcomes, the data that you've shared with me on downward mobility, middle quintile whites and blacks have very different futures, with many of the black people who were born into that middle quintile between the 40th and 60% of the income distribution from their families moved downward through the course of their life, whereas many white people have stayed within that neighborhood or moved slightly higher. And that's a very, very profound, what am I saying?
Very profound.
Verdict on this notion of our success in creating opportunity.
That's right. And those data need to be understood contextually. Middle class and well-off African Americans are far more likely to live in neighborhoods with significant numbers of poor people than their white counterparts. Middle class and better off African Americans often take sometimes their meager household wealth and use it to support poor family members. Those kinds of ties are important for sustaining the well-being of less well-off members of your family, but they're also a real financial burden for many middle-class African Americans. And then you throw in the long historical legacies of segregation and the lack of the accumulation of wealth in housing markets, and problems in workplaces in terms of discrimination, and you've got the ingredients for an enduring racial gap. One that's changed. Yes, it's not the same as it was in 1950 or 1970, but one that's changed pretty slowly relative to the great hopes of the civil rights era. History is a burden that the present bears, right? The world that we live in wasn't made or remade with a wave of a wand with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 or with the global economic crisis of 2008. Things change at those critical junctures, but we have to pay attention to continuities as well as discontinuities and not assume that history is a little package that we can kind of put there in the past and forget about. And ideas and shaping the assumptions that policymakers have.
Conventional wisdom, as they call it.
The conventional wisdom, right? This matters.
Unconscious resonance of history is very powerful within that.
Yeah. And so I think the best history provides necessary context for understanding what's happening now and what might happen tomorrow.